Arban Kalmendi walked into London with nothing but a forged passport and a burning ambition, yet within a decade his name whispered fear across the city's underworld. Besnik Dashi, once a soldier hardened by Balkan wars, became the silent enforcer whose brutality carved respect where none was given. Behind them stood Mentor Hoxha, a shadowy mastermind who never touched drugs himself but built the empire that would flood London's streets with them. Together, these men transformed from faceless immigrants into the architects of a hidden kingdom, rewriting the rules of power through loyalty, silence, and blood. Their story is not just about crime, it is about how a handful of ruthless figures took one of the world's greatest cities and bent it to their will. London in the late 1990s was already a city ruled by shadows. Crime had roots in every neighborhood, from the bustling markets of East London to the glittering clubs of the West End. Turkish groups managed the heroin supply, Jamaican gangs controlled parts of the street trade, and Russians thrived in money laundering. Yet while the police focused on these familiar enemies, another group arrived quietly and went almost unnoticed. The Albanian Mafia came with little fanfare, blending into immigrant communities and never drawing attention. They rented small apartments, worked modest jobs, and moved as if they were just another wave of people looking for opportunity. Beneath that cover, however, they were calculating their rise, studying the weaknesses of London's underworld and waiting for the right moment to strike. Their advantage was experience. Many of these men came from a land scarred by conflict, where loyalty and revenge were written into family codes. They were hardened by years of blood feuds and organized networks in the Balkans. Unlike other gangs that flaunted their strength, the Albanians moved quietly, learning how nightclubs, bars, and construction businesses operated. They began taking over small pieces of territory, offering protection to struggling business owners, and making connections with drug suppliers. Their discipline set them apart. They operated like a military unit rather than a loose group of criminals, and this discipline made them nearly impossible to challenge. The early years were about building trust and gathering resources. London was perfect for this strategy, a city of constant movement, where foreign gangs blended easily and where the police had limited resources to track them all. The Albanians used this to their advantage, creating pipelines of narcotics and slowly establishing dominance over small but crucial corners of the market. Street dealers who resisted quickly found themselves out of business, sometimes disappearing altogether. Those who accepted the Albanians' terms prospered under their protection, earning money while providing loyalty to their new masters. By the end of the decade, it was clear that they were no longer a small immigrant crew. They were becoming a force strong enough to challenge the old powers of London's underworld. Without firing a single public shot, they had positioned themselves as the future rulers of the city's criminal empire. The streets did not yet realize who was pulling the strings, but behind the closed doors of hidden bars and backroom meetings, whispers of the Albanian Mafia began to spread like wildfire. Their quiet invasion was complete, and their grip on London was only beginning. The Albanians' true rise began with the drug pipeline, a system that transformed them from minor players into the most feared force in London. Their homeland gave them an advantage that no rival could match. Albania sat on the Balkan route, the centuries-old smuggling corridor that carried opium and heroin from Afghanistan through Turkey, across Eastern Europe, and into the wealthy streets of the West. When cocaine became the drug of choice in London's nightclubs, the Albanians adapted instantly, using their existing channels to import and distribute vast quantities with precision. Unlike other groups who squabbled for scraps, they positioned themselves as wholesalers, supplying pure product at lower prices and quickly swallowing entire markets. Their method was simple but ruthless. Street dealers were approached with an offer: work for the Albanians and profit, or refuse and face ruin. Many who resisted were found beaten, their shops vandalized, or their families threatened until they gave in. In extreme cases, those who challenged the system simply disappeared, their absence a warning to anyone else thinking of defiance. The Albanians didn't need to announce their power. Their reputation spread through fear and whispers, forcing rivals to submit without a fight. What made them even more dangerous was their structure. Unlike chaotic street gangs, the Albanians ran their operations with a corporate mindset. At the bottom were young men handling deliveries, collection, and street-level trade. Above them were trusted lieutenants managing shipments and finances. At the top sat figures who rarely appeared in public, protected by layers of loyalty and fear. This structure made it nearly impossible for police to reach the real decision-makers. Arrests happened, but every time one man was taken off the street, another instantly filled his place. The machine kept running without interruption. By the mid-2000s, the Albanians controlled most of the cocaine and heroin flooding into London. Even long-standing gangs, once proud of their independence, quietly began buying from them instead of competing. It was a shift few could have predicted. Authorities mentioned Albanian groups in reports, but they were still seen as small-time players. Meanwhile, billions in profit flowed through hidden routes into London's neighborhoods, fueling the empire's expansion. Without warning, the balance of power in the underworld had shifted, and the Albanians now stood at the center of it all. Their dominance was no longer just a possibility, it had become an unshakable reality. Power in the criminal world is never secured without blood, and the Albanians proved this with a cold precision that sent shockwaves through London's underworld. As their control expanded, bodies began to turn up in grim locations across the city. A nightclub owner who refused to pay protection money was discovered in his office, beaten so savagely he was barely recognizable. A Turkish gang leader was shot outside his home in broad daylight, a single bullet to the head, leaving no doubt that it was an execution. In abandoned warehouses, corpses were found with bound hands, their fates a chilling reminder of what awaited anyone who challenged the new rulers. None of these killings were sloppy. They carried the signature of professionals. Every act of violence served a purpose to terrify rivals and silence opposition before it could grow. What made the Albanians' rise even more terrifying was their ability to control the silence around their crimes. Witnesses who saw too much were either bribed into loyalty or intimidated into vanishing altogether. In cases where someone attempted to cooperate with the authorities, they rarely survived long enough to testify. The fear of retribution stretched deep into communities, where families knew better than to speak against them. Even the police admitted privately that getting information was nearly impossible. The Albanians operated within a strict code of loyalty, often bound by family ties or old blood oaths that went back to their homeland. Betrayal was unthinkable, and the price for it was death. London's other gangs quickly realized the futility of resistance. Those who had once dominated certain neighborhoods found themselves pushed out with brutal efficiency. The Albanians did not waste time with drawn-out wars. Their violence was swift, their message clear, and their enemies erased almost overnight. Each unsolved murder strengthened their reputation as an unstoppable force, until even seasoned criminals refused to utter their names aloud. By the late 2000s, the Albanians had earned a fearsome reputation, not just for their drugs, but for their merciless enforcement. London had seen many waves of organized crime, but never one this disciplined, this silent, and this deadly. The blood in the shadows was a language everyone in the underworld understood, and it told a simple truth: the Albanians had arrived, and their rule would be written in violence. The more power the Albanians gained on London's streets, the more money poured into their hands. Billions in profits from cocaine and heroin needed to be disguised, and London's financial system offered the perfect cover. The city was a magnet for global wealth, a place where money could vanish into a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The Albanians seized the opportunity. They began buying up properties in cash, slipping into neighborhoods that were already awash with investment. Luxury apartments, office buildings, and even entire rows of houses changed hands with little scrutiny. Their true owners hidden behind layers of false names and corporate fronts. On the surface, it looked like London's booming property market. In reality, it was a criminal empire laundering its fortune. The drug money also flowed into everyday businesses. Car washes, restaurants, bars, and nightclubs became convenient fronts, generating just enough legitimate income to cover the shadow of illegal profits. Some establishments were used as meeting points, where deals were struck in back rooms while the public saw only a normal night out. Others existed purely as paper entities, producing financial records that masked the millions being funneled through them. By the time investigators traced a single thread, it had already been woven into a web of international transactions that stretched far beyond London's borders. This financial infiltration made the Albanians untouchable in a way brute force never could. While police scrambled to catch street-level dealers, the real bosses operated in luxury apartments and private offices, far removed from the dirt of the trade. They looked more like businessmen than gangsters, dressing sharply and investing in legitimate ventures across Europe. To the untrained eye, they were entrepreneurs. In reality, They were laundering blood money into respectability. The most disturbing part was how easily London's system allowed this to happen. Loopholes in property laws, weak regulations around cash transactions, and a culture of secrecy in banking provided fertile ground. Every time authorities thought they had found a lead, it dissolved into a trail of offshore accounts in places like Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, or Switzerland. The Albanians were not just ruling the streets. They were embedding themselves into the very fabric of the city's economy. By the late 2000s, their money was everywhere, invisible yet unavoidable, and it became clear that their empire was built not only on violence but also on financial genius. By the 2010s, the Albanian Mafia had become the most powerful and mysterious criminal organization in London. Their influence stretched from the back alleys of council estates to the glittering clubs of the West End, from run-down pubs to luxury penthouses. They controlled the flow of cocaine and heroin with an iron grip, supplying the majority of the city's demand while keeping their own leaders shielded in secrecy. What set them apart was not only their brutality but also their restraint. Unlike other gangs that flaunted wealth and waged loud turf wars, the Albanians built an empire on discipline, operating more like a corporation than a street crew. Their presence was everywhere and nowhere at once, a silent rule that few dared to challenge. To the average Londoner, the city appeared and changed. People partied in clubs, property prices rose, and nightlife thrived. Yet behind the curtain, the Albanians orchestrated it all. They avoided unnecessary attention, keeping leaders in the background, while middlemen handled the dirty work. If police arrested a dealer, another stepped in immediately. If a rival tried to carve out space, they disappeared in a flash of violence. This constant balance of fear and order ensured that the hierarchy at the top remained untouched, insulated by loyalty, blood ties, and an unbreakable code of silence. Even law enforcement admitted their frustration. Operations were launched, informants were recruited, and drug shipments were intercepted, yet the core structure remained intact. Every victory for the police was merely symbolic. Like cutting the branches of a tree while the roots stayed deeply buried underground, the Albanians knew how to adapt, shifting tactics whenever pressure grew too strong. Their leaders invested in more businesses, moved money across borders, and used their networks to stay one step ahead of every investigation. The most unsettling truth was how ordinary life continued under their hidden rule. Londoners bought property, enjoyed nightlife, and consumed drugs without ever realizing whose hands shaped these markets. The Albanian Mafia had embedded itself so deeply into the city that tearing it out would mean unraveling parts of the economy itself. What began as a quiet invasion in the late 1990s had, 2 decades later, transformed into an unseen empire. It was a kingdom built not with crowns or flags but with fear, blood, and billions in laundered money. And as long as that empire remained invisible, London would always belong to them, no matter what the headlines claimed.